Online learning is the new frontier of education, and as such, it's a rapidly developing area. Um, and to face the challenges of any new area, there seems to be two main approaches at the moment. You've got one side who jump too quickly on new technological fads, and then the other side who are too resistant and entrenched in old or outdated ideas and see themselves kind of as gatekeepers. And I believe the solution to the challenges we face lies somewhere in the middle. My understanding of education has really evolved over the years I've worked here in Trinity College. I can see why a number of our processes are in place. On a surface level, they make sense. But from the very beginning, I've really pushed for the understanding that there's a reason it's called instructional design and not instructional fundamentalism. And I think there's a risk that if we don't adapt as we progress, there's a risk of us veering into the second of these images. The principles used are logical, but they're not always effectively executed. The main hurdle I've encountered here while trying to encourage a fresh look at our work is the fact that I don't have a degree in multimedia education, which is true. And the other thing I hear a lot of is the fact that our system is based on best practice research, and for that reason, we shouldn't really change what we're doing now. And in an effort to address my potential blind spots, I spent the last couple of years, in particular the last year, reading up on online research and also looking at e-learning books, particularly the one by Mayer, his latest edition from 2016, which is E-Learning and the Science of Instruction. So what surprised me then was the more I read, how often his viewpoint seemed to contradict some of the fundamental ideas we have at the core of our current approach. My approach to education has really evolved the more that I've learned, and I would love the opportunity to bring my learnings to the company as a whole. Now, there isn't time in one presentation to discuss everything, but I would like to touch on a couple of the points that my research has revealed and talk about ways that we could address them with just little course corrects. Now, I know that not all research is made to the same standard, so just to be on the safe side, all the research that I will reference during this video will be based on research that Mayer himself has referenced and promoted. First up, the multimedia principle, and that is basically that graphics and text are better than just text. Now, this is true, but only when you're using highly relevant instructional illustrations and when you ensure that the text, whether that's audio or on-screen text, directly references what's important in the image. If there isn't something to say about the image, it probably shouldn't be there. The key here is highly relevant and instructional. The example they give in the book is this image of how a pump works. When I raised the question internally about whether the images we were using were appropriately highly relevant images, I was directed towards a slide very similar to this one that uses a generic icon that we have taken from a free online gallery. I was told that an image such as this would help me learn the information on the slide. None of the research I have read seems to suggest this. In fact, it seems to argue the opposite. The research shows that even highly interesting images such as the ones on this slide seem to offer a negative learning experience as they can distract from the principle actually being demonstrated on screen. It's not to say that you can never use images like this. I'd never say anything like that. But our current approach seems to focus around using images like this on nearly every slide that we produce. This takes time from the genuinely talented designers that we have here that I feel could be better spent creating less but more effective, personalized learning imagery that's created specifically for the material. Interestingly, Yeager and Wiley reported that students tended to misjudge how much they've learned when they were working with a presentation that included decorative illustrations, but were much more accurate in how much they'd learned when working with a presentation with very strong instructive illustrations or no illustrations at all. So the danger of a presentation with just decorative imagery or relying on decorative imagery is that students believe they're learning more than they are and they're moving on from the material before they've really learned what they need to. Number 2, the redundancy principle. Describing graphics with on-screen text and audio narration is deemed redundant. Now, we tend to follow this rule when we're presenting a graph in our presentations, but for a lot of our slides where it is just text on screen or text and a stock image, we tend to put audio narration over all the on-screen text, identical audio narration. This suggests that we're going with the information acquisition approach to learning, where we see it as just our job to present the information, and it's up to the learner to decide whether to take in the audio narration or the on-screen text. The problem with this is the research doesn't seem to support it. A cognitive approach to learning, that is, taking an approach that works with how people learn, seems to have a much better basis in results. A cognitive approach to learning focuses on how people learn and aims to deliver the right information in the right format at the right time. If you just think about it from a human point of view, it's hard to see how having the on-screen text and identical audio narration could be beneficial for the student. We read faster than we can listen, and so it's very hard for us not to let our eyes track ahead while reading and then have to jump back to find where the audio narration is. So our attention is divided. Our limited cognitive resources are dueling with two sets of the same information coming in at two different speeds through two different sensors. Mayer himself warned that learners may try to compare and reconcile on-screen text and the narration, which requires cognitive processing extraneous to learning the content. This means there's a risk that while they're doing this, they're not actually having the time to consider what the words actually mean. In a series of 8 experimental comparisons where students were given a multimedia lesson on lightning, students in the non-redundant group produced more solutions on a problem-solving transfer test than students in the redundant group, yielding a median effect size greater than 1, which is considered large. My suggestion would be to try a blend, use audio narration where appropriate to describe graphics and graphs, and then allow some screens of just text to allow the viewer to work through it at their own speed. There isn't clear research yet on the effectiveness of this approach, but there is clear research that adding both like we do currently isn't necessarily a good thing. Number 3, the personalization principle. People learn better when their e-learning environment uses a conversational style of writing and speaking, polite wording for feedback and advice, and a friendly human voice. A boundary condition of this is that this principle does seem to work best for less experienced learners, but I haven't seen any research that indicates there's a detrimental effect on higher level learners. It's really very simple. Conversational works. We engage and connect with people the more they sound like real human beings. If we feel like someone is talking to us and not at us, our ears open up and we find it much easier to accept the information and opinions that they're presenting to us. I think the resistance to this notion comes from a misguided belief that it's a ones and zeros situation, that either you're completely formal or you're completely casual. And when people hear the term conversational, they assume a teacher in a Hawaiian t-shirt and shorts. All conversational means is speaking like a real human being. As Mayer states, when an instructional lesson does not contain social cues, the learner does not feel engaged with the author and therefore will not work as hard to make sense of the material. If our principal interest is to provide the highest standard of education to our students, we need to shift away from this one-size-fits-all approach and cut and paste script templates. We may feel we offer these script templates as simply a guide, but a number of academics have told me that they feel compelled to stick to these. We often say that our job is to present learning materials, but I think a better way to say that is that our job is to effectively communicate these materials. And that's where my experience in film and documentary really helps bolster my approach. To effectively convey information, an attitude, the relevance of something, you have to pay attention to not just what you're saying, but how you say it and also how you express it visually. I tell everyone I work with that an online environment is very different than being in a classroom because you're not speaking out to a room full of people. Your relationship now is a one-to-one relationship because usually on the other side of that screen, the person sitting at their desk is just there on their own. So when you're speaking to these people, what you have to do is change your tone, your approach, your attitude to how you would talk to one person who's sitting there in front of you. Now, it may sound like that's a small change, but you'd be amazed the difference something like that can make. Take, for example, these videos shot with the exact same academics just a couple of weeks apart, the first under my direction, and then the second with an external person who came in to film the academics while I was on parental leave with the birth of my daughter. Pay attention to their passion and energy when they're delivering their words in the first video compared to just delivering the information in the second.
Learning about these research projects will inspire you to think deeply about the key global development challenges facing the world. You will learn more about what governments, donors, and NGOs are doing to address these challenges, and also how research can contribute to this process. She uses an alternative approach to exploring this issue and developed a theoretical model to simultaneously promote women's economic empowerment and reduce violence by providing social transfers in the form of goods rather than cash.
In many ways, the program resembles a standard community health worker program. So the women, after receiving an initial training on basic health practices, are providing simple health education and simple health services to the other members of the community. If you compare the test scores for these children, you might not be sure that the difference that you might observe in their test scores is really driven by computer-assisted learning.
Even the smallest changes, like changing the next button on the slide to a continue button, could make all the difference. It's far more friendly, and it also implies a conscious decision on the part of the learner to continue their learning, as opposed to the more conveyor belt sounding next. Think these things don't make much of a difference? Mayer, Fennell, Farmer and Campbell changed the word the to your in just 11 places on a script. This tiny adjustment resulted in improvements on a transfer test yielding a median effect size of 0.79, where 0.5 is considered moderate and 1 is considered a large change. And as a side note, when HubSpot changed one of their clients' call to action buttons from green to red for a few days, they increased conversions by 21%. Imagine if we could increase inquiries on our courses by 20% with such a small change. I'm not saying you'd see these results in every situation, but I do feel we need to be open-minded to optimizing and refining all the time. These seemingly small things really matter. Number 4, educating the learner on how best to learn. Research has shown that worked examples are more effective than practical problems, but only if the students take the time to study them. And as a result, some e-learning practitioners tend to avoid worked examples for fear that the students won't engage with them. But instead, why aren't we coming up on screen and taking the time to talk to the student, to explain to them the benefits of them? What if, just before the worked examples, the lecturer came up on screen and explained to them that this is the difference in learning from those who engaged with work examples, and these are the ones who did just practice ones themselves? I believe our job is to inform, to help the learners find out how best to learn, to explain to them the techniques we're using and why we use them. At the moment, we just present information and expect them to engage without telling them the benefits of engaging with the materials in the way that we suggest. The more our learners feel enabled by us, the more they will trust us and the more they will engage with our learning materials. Number 5, reviewing our basics. Is there a strong reason why we are still using a 16:9 PowerPoint style slideshow format? Most of our learners will be engaging with our materials on a tablet, a laptop, or a desktop, and these screens are capable of holding a lot more information than the large font style format that we're currently using. You'd never see a textbook with such large and limited amounts of words on one page, and slideshows were really invented for lecture theatres, where students sitting at the back of the room would have to be able to read the information, so the fonts needed to be big. But the people who are learning with us are sitting in front of their screen. They're not that far away from it. For some topics, I believe it would be beneficial for the students to be able to read down the page to complete an idea or point rather than having to click through multiple slides and piecing it together that way. Or even worse, having to face unnecessarily cluttered slides. When it comes to our current approach to video, we tend to use it in the exact same way for every single project. Intro videos in front of every session, maybe an interview video here or there. What I'd love to do is go back and boil down what we're trying to achieve and then see where a video is appropriate. I think what will actually probably be more beneficial is more smaller little snippets of videos that are inserted, say, into a presentation where a lecturer can appear on screen and directly address a principle that's important, or if there's a case study or something they want to discuss that they feel can't be represented in a slide, that they can actually directly engage with the learner and really get across their point and their attitude and explain what's important to it. Another really interesting potential for video is if you're teaching something like statistics. Muldner, Lamb and Chi showed that watching a video of one-on-one tutoring had nearly the same benefit for pairs of students watching the video as the student having the one-to-one tutoring themselves. After observing the video, the students then completed a similar example themselves. And notice the difference here between those watching a video of a student being tutored compared to watching a video of a lecture on the same material. So where to now? Mayer himself says that certainly it is easier to base courses on the design recommendations of experts or on common practice, but it's always worthwhile to ask, yes, but does it work? We need to reflect on our current processes and be willing to fairly assess where we're being appropriately cautious, but also be willing to acknowledge where they may need some adjusting. We need to have an open mind and an understanding that education is a craft and not a mechanical process. We also need to, very importantly, shift our focus from allowing student feedback forums to gauge our successes, because time and time again, research has shown us that students are a very poor judge of how well their learning experience has been. Mayer himself explicitly states that we do not recommend asking students solely to rate how much they think they have learned or how well they liked a lesson. More often than not, what they think worked didn't. The truth will be in the data: retainment, engagement, results, quantifiable data that we can use to benchmark our successes, things we can use to test whether new changes we have made are actually improving the materials the way we believe they are. And it's this that's going to allow us to create best-in-class materials, not just in Ireland, but all across the world. None of these changes are radical. In fact, some of them may seem reasonably small, but the trickle-down effect of implementing them all will be substantial. It's about making courses clean, more appealing, and most importantly, more effective. And I know that our staff will be much happier under one single unified student-focused vision. If people want to discuss any of these ideas with me, I think that's great. It's exactly what we need. Open discussion to make sure that all viewpoints are considered. The most dangerous thing that we could do is to assume that we perfected online education 5 years ago. We had a really great start, but there's a lot more that we can do to fully deliver on the promise of Trinity online education. We all understand that time constraints and workload sometimes means that we need courses that require low intensity supervision from our end of things. But that doesn't necessarily have to mean cookie cutter courses or cut and paste scripts. There's nothing wrong with templates. We need them. We just need to design them with the right core principles in mind. And we need to make sure that our staff have the time and the resources to be able to research the materials like the stuff I've discussed today, so that we can all become our own area experts and bring that stuff to the table to ensure that we are delivering the best courses possible, and also so that everyone feels that their opinion matters and that they're informed. It's not about breaking the rules, it's about using the most up-to-date research available to us and combining it with an understanding about how people learn and what connects with people. Because at the end of the day, that's who we're teaching: people.